Hello, everyone, and many thanks for attending this session on explainable AI for health and medicine. That's part of the King's Festival of Artificial Intelligence in 2025. So the festival has been organized by the King's Institute of Artificial Intelligence, and this is the third year that it has brought a wide array of free events to both King's and external audiences to showcase the range of AI expertise across King's breadth. So this year, there are over 45 separate events happening over 5 days between May 20th and May 24th. So if you'd like to find out more about the King's Institute for AI, join our mailing list, or find out about other events in the festival, please do go to www.kcl.ac.uk/AI or follow the King's Institute on social media. Before we get started, let me give you a bit of housekeeping. So please ensure your microphone is switched to silent. And please add your questions to the Q&A throughout the talk, because we're going to pose these to the speaker after today's presentation. So today, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Anthony Batista. He's a postdoctoral research fellow at King's College London, and he works alongside Dr. Christopher Banerjee and Gregory Verghese in the Cancer Bioinformatics team at King's College London. So, Anthony, take it away.
Thank you for the introduction. So, hello everybody. So today we will talk about explainable AI for health and medicine. So I will go first with a very basic thing. So you can send me an email, or if you have any question following the talk, to me at my email address, or to Gregory or to Chris. We are very keen to reply to any kind of question, even if it's a very basic question. It's also the aim of this presentation. So today we talk about AI, and more particularly about explainable AI, because it's a need to have something that we fully understand for health and medicine. So the first part will be an overview of AI model. So it will be from the very basic things to the more sophisticated models. So to give you like a brief history of what is AI first. So an AI is a technology that enables to simulate the human learning, comprehension, decision-making, problem-solving, or more recently, creativity. Because when you think about creativity, you can think about ChatGPT or this kind of model, but this kind of model is pretty recent. And what people call by artificial intelligence is pretty old now, because you can think about the first definition, the first models in the early 50s. And during the 80s, you have the development of a large kind of models about machine learning. So you have some very common one, like the support vector machine, random forest, that was based on the decision tree. So all these words, I will give you some example just after. Also the regression models, the Bayesian approaches, genetic programming, and last decade, you see appear more deeper model, also called deep neural networks or deep learning. So for this one, you have multi-layer perceptron, autoencoder, convolutional neural network, graph neural network, and generative adversarial network. That is the first step from the deep learning to the generative AI. And very recently, a few years ago, I think you hear about foundation models or some models like ChatGPT, Llama, Claude, all these kind of models that is more like some chatbot, but this model are more general than just a chatbot. So you have all these kind of model. So it's pretty huge, GPT, Llama, BERT, and so on. And some of them are more focused for researchers. Some of them is more broad, like ChatGPT. But all these kind of models can be called under the umbrella of generative AI. So if I go back to the machine learning model, so for example, the support vector machine is really, it comes from really from linear algebra, some pretty basic math if you have a math degree. So the idea is to define some plane. If it's in higher dimension, it's called an hyperplane, but it's like a generalization of a plane, to divide it the two different or more different kind of classes. For instance, if the dots represent some patient, you have some patient can be healthy and the patient that have some disorder. The idea is to define the optimal hyperplanes that can separate these both communities. So it's pretty basic, but it can be very efficient, and this kind of model can be used when you have some classes that is easy to separate more linearly. It's a good model. Also the decision tree. So the decision tree is something very intuitive, because if you think as a physician, you use this kind of tree. For example, if you have to make a diagnosis, for example, if you have to make a diagnosis for the risk of a heart attack, you first ask to the patient his age to determine if it's under 18, between 18 and 30, or for higher than 30 years old. And after, for example, if the patient is between 18 and 30, is low risk to have a heart attack. But if it's lower than 18, you have to ask another question about the weight of the patient. So if it's under 60, yeah, is low risk, and if it's higher 60, is high risk. And in the case of the patient that is higher than 30 years old, you have to ask if the patient is a smoker. And if it's no, it's a low risk. And if it's yes, it's high risk. So you see, from based on this different question, we can have a diagnosis if the patient is low risk or high risk, depending on the height of the patient, and then if the weight of the patient, and the condition, if it's smoke or not. So yeah, you go from this kind of thing is very intuitive, but you can use this model to define different weights, because if you have your data, in this case, you have the weight is predefined, because it's under 18, over 30, and so on. But when you use machine learning, the idea is to define these weights according to the training data. So you have some data, some information, and you have to define this weight. But when you have this kind of decision tree, depending on which kind of data you have, you can design some model that is too associated to some kind of data. So some people just of that develop something called random forest. And the idea of the random forest is the generalization of the decision tree. So in this case, you have a lot of trees. So that's why it's called a forest. And every tree is trained on a subpart of your data. So you have a very large data with very heterogeneity. It can be a good strategy, because you can imagine this one should be this trees, but for another one, you have a different values of ages. And at the end, to obtain the final result, if the patient is low risk or high risk, you can use an averaging function. So you can take the mean, for instance. So this kind of model is a little bit more robust and more general than the basic decision tree. So all these models are associated to machine learning. And I also call about deep learning, or also sometimes you can hear about neural networks. One of the most basic, but it's still efficient model is the autoencoder. So the autoencoder is represented here. And so you have the neurons, is like the dots, and you have the link is the weight. And so you go from one layer to another layer. So in the autoencoder, you have three parts. The first part is an encoder. So it can be associated that the learning part. So for instance, if you learn math, you can learn how to solve some equation. And after you have the latent space that can be represented as the definition and how to do things. It's like the core of your learning process. And after you have the decoder, and the decoder is how to use this learning step, this information, this knowledge to ask to solve some different tasks. It can be classification, it can be labeling, it can be anything else. And so this kind of model is one among a lot of different kind of architecture, different kind of architecture of networks. And on the right, you can see all this diversity, so it's non-exhaustive. So you have the basic perceptron, the multi-layer perceptron that I talked at the beginning. It was label MLP. It's just several layers of perceptron. So in this one, you have 1, 2, and you can imagine to have 1, 2, 3 layers like this one. And something interesting, the perceptron was developed in the 50s. So it's the first model of artificial intelligence, and it was a neural network, and it was one of the first one. So if you're interested, can discuss at the end why you have so big gap between the 50s till the 80s. So you have a very good reason, very good mathematical reason. And very recently, you see appears the foundation models, so like the ChatGPT and these kind of models. So the foundation models obey to 3 different rules. You can say rules. The first one, it should be trained on a very broad and a huge amount of data. After this model can be adapted. So that means you have a pre-training step. So you have data, and after you can fine tune the learning step to reply to some question or to answer to some task. For example, if you question answering, like ChatGPT, you can train your model to be trained on a lot of information, for example, the whole web. And after you can refine the training to some specific kind of question. For example, it can be the languages, for French, English, Spanish. So it could be general language, and after you can focus on different kind of languages. It can be also to extract some information. So Greg will talk about that, to extract from information from different images. It can be also object recognition, can be used for the automatic car to detect some obstacle. So it can be a lot of different things. So this model become very important nowadays, and because they're very general, but you will see this model are not totally explainable. So it's why it will be interesting to address this question just after. So if you go back to the beginning, I show you that you have the machine learning method, the deep learning, and now the foundation model, similar to what you call also generative AI. So the question to determine if this evolution is something natural, I don't think it's natural, but it's logical, because you go from the more basic model to the more complex one, to the model trained on a few amount of data, to the model that trains on millions, even billions of data. You go from the model that is the most explainable and interpretable, because you kind of see the trees, like the decision tree, to some model that is very complex with a lot of different layers, and to the model that is the most specific, task specific, to the one that is the most broad. For example, when you ask ChatGPT, you can ask any kind of question about sports, question about science, question about feelings, and so on. So depending on which kind of question you want to answer, there are no best model, or that all models are good, but there are only some models that are adapted to some specific question. For instance, sometimes the SVM, even if it's basic, can be enough, but sometimes you need something very complicated. But in health and medicine, because you have some constraints, you need to have some explainable and interpretable models. So the interpretable model is a model that can be understand totally. So when you check the output, you can understand the output based on the different steps that drive to this output. So it's what you call by interpretables. For instance, the decision tree, you can understand if the patient is low risk or high risk by go back to the different branches. And the explainability is a set of processes or method that can help the human being to understand the result of the algorithm. So these two definition is pretty important. So sometimes you can have some confusion between explainability and interpretability. So it's slightly different, but for this talk, it's not really important. So you can make the assumption that these both are very similar, but in practice, they are still different. So now I'm going to talk about explainable AI. So that is one of the aim of this talk. So the first question is why you want something explainable. So the first reason is because if you address some biological questions, some medicine, health question, you need to understand why you make this decision. For example, if your patient is low risk and high risk, you don't have the same clinical process. For example, if the patient is low risk, you can say, okay, you can go back to your house. But if the patient is high risk, maybe you should go to see a specialist. So depending on that, you need to understand why this patient is high risk and low risk to avoid to make some misclassification of the patient. Another thing is because AI become more and more used and present in society, you need to have some trustness. So the people should be trust on the decision. And to have this trust, you can see on the left some kind of cycle. You need to interpret the result to make it explainable, to also have some interactivity, to also reinforce the transparency and the responsibility, and also to be more fair. Because if you understand why this result happened, you can also bypass some biases. For instance, a couple of years ago, you can see some racial bias in the use of some AI models, especially in the US, for the risk of recidive of some inmates. So you see that some Black community are highly represented in the data, so the model become a little bit racist in a way because they're trained in some partial data. So if you have some black box model, so a model that is not interpretable, it's difficult to understand that you have some bias. But if the model is a white box, it's easy to understand you have some bias and to fix this bias to make your model fairer. And the deep learning model is by essence something that is like a black box, but the explainable AI is the idea to find different way to make this black box more like a gray box, or at least to have some evidence of explainability and interpretability. So it's why explainable AI is. So I will give you some few examples about some explainable AI models. One of this kind of model is the visual explanation. For example, the most used model is GradCam. And this model, for example, you can imagine you have some images and you want to detect some object or to classify some object. So in this case, on the left, you have the cat and dogs. And you want to ask, in this image, I have some cats, and in this image, I have a dog. So you have the result, and based on this result, you can use GradCam, this model, this explainable model, to investigate what drives my model to obtain this result. And the way you can visualize this explanation is made with a heat map. So you can see the colors, and the color it's show which part of the image is used to make the prediction. For instance, in the case of the cat, you see a very red area around the cat, and nothing around the dog. So it makes sense. You use the part of the cat to define if the cat is in the image, and the same for the dogs. So in this case is very easy to understand. But if you apply this kind of model in biology or in medical science, it becomes more difficult because, for instance, if you want to make a diagnosis based on an MRI, you need to understand what drives the model to make this decision, to make this prediction. And you need to understand in which area of the brain lead to this prediction. For example, if you want to determine if the patient is a Alzheimer, you need to define in which area of the brain that makes some evidence that leads the model to make this prediction. So in this case, it's less straightforward than the cat and the dog. And you can also have another example with some mode. For instance, if you want to define if this mode is benign or malignant, it can be important to determine which leads the model to make this prediction. And you can use this heat map to localize in the images which part of the images is informative to make the prediction. So another model that we're actively working with Greg and Chris is a concept bottleneck model. So in this case, you don't use some heat map, these colors that overlay the images, but you use some concept. For instance, if you take a scanner of a knee, you can determine if the patient have arthritis and define the grade. You can use different concepts, like if he has sclerosis, bone spurs, neurological space, and so on. And based on this different concept that is human interpretable, your model give you a prediction, and you can check the different concept to see which concept is used to make the prediction. For example, if you have, you can imagine to have a binary concept, is sclerosis yes or no, bone spurs yes and no, and you can have this vector or this column of yes and no, of 0 and 1, and you can use this column to interpret the results that drive to this prediction for the patients. So you can have something very similar for the birds. And for example, if you have some image of birds, you can use this concept to make sense of the results. For instance, the model classifies this bird as this kind of birds and can use different concepts, the wing colors, the undertail colors, the beat length, and so on, to make sense and to interpret the results. Finally, it was non-exhaustive. Obviously, there are a lot of different ways to interpret and explain the result of a deep neural network. And another model that is pretty appealing for me, it's some heat map, but that heat map not overlaid on the images, but overlaid on graph. So you can use some graph neural networks, and the prediction can be justified by overlay some heat map over the graph. So the graph will be your representation of your data. So in this case, it's a chemical component, and you want to determine if this chemical component can be used to cure a disease or to reduce some side effect. And you can highlight, so at the end you have an answer, yes or no, and you can use this heat map to make sense about which part of the molecule can make these drugs efficient for a specific purpose. And obviously, there are also other models, some geometric neural network, graph theory can also be used, like this one, because you can resume your data as a graph. So you can use graph theory. And there's also some multimodal model. By multimodal, it means you use different kind of information. For example, if you see a physician, he uses different kind of information. He uses the MRI, the blood test to make the diagnosis. So the AI model can use different kind of information, the images, the blood test, the gene expression, to also assess the prediction and the diagnosis. So now Greg will present you a case study. So it's you, Greg.
Thanks, Anthony. Will you change the slides, Anthony, when I'm ready to move on? Yeah.
I can do that for you if you want.
That's it. Great. Yeah. So I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of how we use AI to build diagnostics, particularly in cancer and pathology. And I'll talk about concept learning, which, as Anthony introduced earlier, is based around these CBM models that we use to make AI explainable. So when you're a cancer patient, your diagnosis will be overseen by a pathologist, and your journey would really start with having a tissue sample extracted either from a biopsy or during surgery. And that tissue sample then gets sent to a lab and it's prepared in a certain way. So it's dyed with this sort of pink, purple dye. It's placed on a glass slide, and that's given then to the pathologist who would assess the tissue under a microscope. And it's that assessment which really forms the basis of your diagnosis. And those slides are physical, so then they would be stored and archived somewhere. Next slide, please, Anthony. So in digital pathology, this is changing. And so, currently most pathology workflows are still using this sort of physical tissue paradigm. But slowly the NHS is digitizing. And so this means really that the extraction of the tissue is the same and the preparation of the slide is the same. But we would then digitize that tissue using these special sort of high resolution image scanners, which gives us this nice image, which is very high resolution. And that image is then passed to the pathologist, and they would assess that tissue on a computer screen. What's nice is that we can then start to build sort of downstream computational methods, and we can leverage, AI and machine learning algorithms to really build algorithms and models that support clinicians making clinical decisions. And we generally call this computational pathology. So obviously the old adage with AI is, the more data, the better. And I think why is healthcare and pathology and biology in general a very exciting kind of area for data scientists? It's because partly the modalities of data that we use have a lot of information in them. So just to kind of give you an example, and this is a slide I like to show to kind of other computer scientists who don't work in the field. This is an image of my cat Salem, and this was taken with a very high resolution camera. And if we compare it to the image next to it, so this is a pathology image of a breast cancer primary tumor, you can see that it's just a tiny speck. And that's because the pathology image is 3 orders of magnitude bigger, or nearly 3 orders of magnitude bigger, right? Because it's about 100,000 by 100,000 pixels. It's nearly 3 gigabytes in size. And that's because these images are stored as these kind of pyramid objects, which means that we can kind of zoom all the way in to see the sort of cellular features, right? Because it's very high resolution. So within a single image, we have huge amounts of information that we can use to train these AI models. Next slide, please, Anthony. This is just another way of comparing the size of the data set. So if you're a computer scientist, you're probably familiar with the data set image net. So this is a data set which consists of natural images, so images of trees, dogs, cars, and it's a benchmark data set that computer scientists generally use to develop AI algorithms. So this data set consists of about 14 million images, where each image is about 250 by 250 pixels. If we compare that data set in terms of the number of pixels, so the amount of information, with a pathology data set, so a data set made up of these whole slide images, you'll see it's about roughly, in pixel terms, 70 pathology slides. So in a very small pathology data set, we have huge amounts of information, right? We have more information than in a data set that our data scientists generally use to train AI algorithms. So there's a lot of information that we can extract, and actually 70 slides would be small even in the context of pathology, right? Because it's generally less than 70 patients. Next slide, please, Anthony. So when we build models in pathology, there are kind of 2 ways we tend to go about this. I kind of refer to these as kind of the top down and the bottom up approach. So the bottom up approach, which is on the left, really is when you start with your slides and you have some pattern or feature that you know that you want to quantify. So you want to train your AI model to be able to capture that particular feature. And you could think of that feature as maybe a type of cell or some specific pattern in the histology. And so we would have a pathologist annotate the slides for maybe those cells or that pattern. And then we would use a supervised model to train a classifier to detect or segment the feature that we're interested in. We could then take that segmentation map or all those detected features and we can do some sort of quantification. So we can look at quantifying maybe how present is that feature, how close are the features to each other, what is the density of that feature over the tissue section. And then we can use that quantification to tell us about some phenotype, so some property of the patient. So we could associate it or correlate it with whether they respond or don't respond to a treatment, or what will their prognosis be? Will they be high risk or will they be low risk? In the top-down approach, we kind of start from the other way around. So we start really from the patient and the phenotype, the property that we want to detect or classify. So for example, we could think about having a data set of breast cancer patients, and we have labels that tell us whether those patients have responded or not responded to chemotherapy treatment. We would then train a model to predict, based off that data set and those labels, whether they respond to the treatment, what their response would be. And then we can use different types of explainable AI methods, sort of post hoc after that model training, to unpack that prediction. So going back to kind of the slide where Anthony talked about visualizing the model's prediction on an image, we can do exactly the same thing in pathology, right? We can overlay the explainable prediction back on the tissue, and we get these heat maps. And we can use those heat maps to identify tissue hotspots, and we can quantify within those specific regions. So again, we can then start to kind of do downstream quantification that tells us something about what are the cell populations in those regions, what are the features, what are the patterns, what do they look like, how present are they, how close are they to each other, what is the density. Next slide, please, Anthony. So this is just an example of a kind of real application. This is one of our research projects. So this is a top-down approach. And so the idea here is that we want to see if we can predict from the pathology image whether the patient has a mutation. So in breast cancer, there's a mutation called BRCA, which is associated with a high risk of developing cancer. And so often a pathologist needs to do molecular tests to understand whether a patient has a certain mutation, because it will inform or dictate what type of treatment they should have. Now, doing that molecular test takes time. It can sometimes take up to 2 weeks, and it costs money. So one of the things we want to see if we can do is actually, can we train an AI model just to look at the image? So this is the standard of care routine slide, or it will be digital image that the pathologist will look like, so no extra material is needed. And by just looking at that image, could they determine from the tissue, from the patterns in the histology, whether their patient has the mutation or not? And so we trained a model. So we take our image and we actually split this image up into much smaller images, because obviously it's so big, it's very computationally exhaustive to work at the image level. We train a model to extract these features, extract the patterns, and that's the encoder that Anthony was referring to earlier. And then we use a label from each patient in our training set that tells us whether they had the mutation or not, to train the model to then predict whether they did, and they associate the patterns, the features that it extracts with that label, and then we can apply it to new data to make a prediction for inference later on. Once we have that trained model, we can use different explainable AI methods. So we can use some of the visualization methods that we talked about earlier, and we can use different methods. So we can use the kind of concept-based learning. We can use this kind of quantification approach that kind of tells us something about the prediction of the model. And so here again, I'm showing an example at the bottom of the slide of a visualization of the model's prediction. You can see those areas of red, which is really where the model is focusing on when it makes a prediction of whether the patient has a mutation or not. And so we can actually pull out the individual areas or tissue regions and then quantify them, see if there's actual morphology that's associated with that phenotype. Next, please, Anthony. So building models, predictive models in pathology and cancer can have, massive benefit. So we could, potentially negate the need for these kind of expensive and sort of tests that take a long time to get, which you can probably see the benefits, right, from an efficiency point of view and a cost point of view. But making predictions isn't enough, right? We need to be able to explain those predictions. We need them to be transparent. And the EU AI Act, which is really the first regulatory framework for AI, has mandated that any AI algorithms within the EU need to be in high risk fields, need to be transparent, need to have human oversight measures, and they need to have some form of uncertainty quantifications. They need to tell you how confident they are in their prediction. Healthcare is classified as a high risk field. So this means that we need these models, which are currently black boxes, to make or give us some understanding of the prediction they make, whether it be for prognosis, treatment response, or biomarker detection. Next, please. Thank you. And so the way that we're thinking about this from our research is, can we align that explainability, that explainable method, with the way that clinicians think? Visualizing the predictions is it's a nice feature. It gives us some idea for research, particularly of what it is that is driving the underlying phenotype. So we can start to unpack cancer biology. But if you're a clinician, you think in terms of clinically interpretable features, right? So as a pathologist, you're thinking about things like stage and age and grade, and what are the risk factors that drive some phenotype or prognostic prediction for a given patient. So we think that these models, concept bottleneck models, are a really nice way of building transparent AI or transparent algorithms for doing diagnostics. So you can think of this approach maybe similar to kind of the top-down methodology I mentioned a couple of slides back, where you would take your image and you would have some label that you want to predict. So that could be treatment response, it could be prognosis, it could be biomarker detection. And again, you would pass that to the model, which you could call an encoder. You would train the model to extract features and associate those features to that target variable. But we would have this intermediate layer, and that intermediate layer is really where we want to learn human interpretable features, or in this case, clinically interpretable features. And so we would learn stage, age, grade, for example, from the image, and then we would use that intermediate representation to make that final target prediction. In this case, that could be treatment response. What's quite nice about this is that you can then look at that prediction as a clinician, and you can go and see the concepts that were driving that prediction. And if the concepts don't seem right, so if it's a high risk prediction, but the stage is very low, the age is very young, and the grade is very low, then the model, the clinician has oversight and can spot when the model is making an incorrect decision. On top of that, what's quite nice is also, just pop back one, Anthony, back to the previous slide. That's right, thank you. On top of that, what's quite nice is that we can also have this human in the loop oversight. So not only can the clinician spot that the prediction is wrong, they can actually correct it. So they could look at those concepts. And in this case, on the right, I've got an example where the stage has been incorrectly predicted because the target is predicted as high risk, but the stage is low. And so they could then correct that specific concept, and the model can iteratively update itself. Sorry, next slide, Anthony. Thank you. So just wanted to finish on really where we're going with AI in general. So I've kind of given an example of AI in pathology and in cancer, but really the next frontier, what we're seeing from a lot of research now, is this idea of multimodal AI. So this is where a model is actually learning patterns and features, not from a single modality, so not just from pathology, but it's combining it with other modalities in healthcare as well. So it's learning features from pathology, from radiology, from genomics, from clinical text, all in parallel. And the model uses all of that information to learn something about the given patient. And that same model can then be used for a range of different downstream medical tasks. And the way that I like to think about this is it's like a clinical multidisciplinary team. So this is where you would have all of the experts with all of their different respective modalities of data sitting around making a decision about a patient's diagnosis. So you can imagine the radiologist sitting with the imaging, the pathologist with the pathology information, and the oncologist with the treatment information. And so I think of these multimodal models as an MDT where you have all the experts and all the data in a single model. And we're seeing a lot of research in this space now, and certainly Google have been developing their Gemini or MedGemini series of models to be multimodal. Thanks, Anthony. So I just wanted to kind of finish by showing this video, which I think is quite a nice demonstration of a multimodal model, where this is kind of like a chat GPT like application. This model is being trained on images, pathology images, and clinical text pairs. And what's quite amazing is that you can kind of highlight the different regions of histology, and then you can ask it clinical questions, right? And it will respond with quite robust clinical answers. And so you can probably see there kind of huge amounts of potential application and benefit for clinicians of this type of tool. So it could be used to support them with their sort of clinical decision making when they're doing diagnosis. But I think other downstream applications like education, right? This kind of nice interactive features that which could help support the younger generation of doctors when they're training to be pathologists. And certainly we can use tools like this for research, right? It can help us understand kind of specific regions of the tissue and start to think about what is going on in terms of the cancer biology. Next slide, please, Anthony. And so one of the important things of when we're developing multimodal AI is having access to lots of data from across those modalities. And some of the challenges we face when we develop AI is actually getting access to robust data sets that really represent the true sort of distribution of patient demographics. And so this is a new initiative and a project which is recently been funded by the UK government. It's a partnership between 4 institutes, so 2 trusts, King's College London, Queen Mary University of London, Barts Trust, and Guy's and St Thomas Trust. And it brings together about 56 different partners from across the life sciences industry, so from regulators to the NHS to different commercial companies like biotech and pharmaceutical companies and drug discovery companies, infrastructure providers like Google, Microsoft, and Dawn, to really build a repository and platform that makes available very robust and high quality multimodal data in a secure way. So it's built around 2 biobanks that have been collecting tissue data now for over 50 years. And the idea is that we will go in and digitize a lot of that data, turning it into those pathology images that you see, do lots of molecular profiling to understand the details of a patient's DNA and RNA. And then we make that available in this very secure environment for researchers to come in and use those data sets to build AI tools. Next, please, Anthony. Thank you. And yeah, so the focus will really be around curating data sets that have lots of depth. So for each patient, we want to create a lot of information across these different modalities. This is based around 2 biobanks. We have a biobank at King's College London and one at Guy's and St Thomas. Sorry, King's College London and one at Barts NHS Trust, which is called the Breast Cancer Now Tissue Bank. We have more than 100,000 patients where we have physical tissue. And we will go in and digitize and enrich that tissue, and then we will link that with the other types of clinical data. So information which is clinical text on, their patient's medical history, types of treatments they've had, how they responded to those treatments. And we will do sequencing. So we will sequence the DNA and we will sequence the RNA as well. And then, like I said, we'll put these data sets on a platform which will allow researchers to use the data and come up with new insights and innovations with AI tools. Thanks, Anthony.
Thank you, Greg. So this is the end of the presentation. So if you have a look to the full personal program, you can have a look with this QR code. And now I will reply to some of the questions.
Thanks, Anthony. Thanks, Greg. So there's a few questions here in the chat. So the first one, actually, it came before you guys showed the video, but I think it's still very interesting. It's asking, why can't we just ask the software, the model, right, how it derived a certain decision, like we can do with ChatGPT, or if the software is not a language model, if we can say it's just focused on image detection, can we build something like a conversational application into the software to understand how it works?
To reply, Greg, or should I start?
I mean, I can start, and then maybe Anthony, you can pick up. So I think when we talk about explainability, we're trying to explain the model's predictions, right? So that's part of the learning process. We understand the steps that led up to that target prediction. So actually asking an LLM why it made a prediction in itself is a prediction. So it's kind of this sort of feedback loop where you're not actually truly understanding the underlying model steps that gave you an answer. So I think there is lots of work in kind of building text-based explainability. And obviously with the concept learning, we are trying to do that to a level where we provide these kind of human interpretable textual features, and we align those with the way that a clinician thinks. Obviously on the vision side, we then use these kind of visual models to show us where the model is looking. But explainability is really about understanding the steps that the model has taken to make a given prediction. Anthony, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, maybe just one thing. It's a question of what the community call hallucination. It's something also important to take into account. For instance, if you ask to ChatGPT something, it can explain why it go to this result, but sometimes the answer is not consistent because it can create his own narrative to justify the answer. So the large language model of these kind of models, the generative AI models, sometimes hallucinate. So they create a wrong answer and can justify in a pretty accurate way. So in the context of large language model, it's not that important because if it's wrong, it's okay. But in the case of healthcare, you shouldn't accept that. So that's why you need to have something fully explainable. And as Greg mentioned, you have a lot of possibility like the CBM or some gradient heat map explainability. So.
Thanks. So there have been several questions about the CBMs. So let's get into that a little bit more. So for example, how do you come up with the concepts such as stage, age, grade, unknown? How do you, and usually, and how many do you usually need to get a good prediction? That can you answer those both?
Yeah. So it's a really good question. So I mean, I think ultimately the concepts are decided a priori by the developer of or the user of the model, right? I think in the case of what we're doing is the clinician would select the clinical concepts that are important for the given task that we're trying to predict. So we chose stage, age, and grade because we know in the application that we're trying to build, which is prognosis, those concepts are highly correlated and they're sort of standard concepts that a pathologist would look at. The thing about the concepts, though, is that you can have a challenging where a difficult thing can happen where you have this kind of correlation structure between concepts, and that can make the prediction of your model not necessarily be robust, right? Because the model wants to take the path of least resistance. And so often it can cheat by kind of exploiting these correlation structures to make its final prediction, and it's not truly predicting the concepts correctly. So how you select the concepts has to be thought out quite carefully to make sure you choose concepts that from an information perspective as orthogonal as possible, so they're not highly correlated, and they have to be relevant to the task that you're trying to predict, right? They have to give some reasonable explanation which makes sense to the end user. So in our case, this is a clinician.
Yeah, so it's a very good question because in the concept bottleneck, the concept design, it's a task by itself because it's not trivial. If you have an expert knowledge with clinician, you can design this, but if you don't have this expert knowledge, it's very difficult to design. And even sometimes, as Greg mentioned, you can have some overlap between the concept and you can have some leakage. And there are a lot of other issues that can mention like the locality and so on. So.
Okay, so then clarification question here. So the final output is based just on the concepts and so not necessarily using all the information in the image?
Also a good question. So I actually didn't mention this, but yes, so if you were just to base it on the concepts that you selected, you would be basing the final prediction on your set of concepts, right? And that kind of constrains your model to a certain solution space. And the power of AI is that it can explore a space of patterns that maybe are not discernible by the human eye when we're talking about vision models. So there are different ways of mitigating that. And one of the nice ways of doing it, I think, which is quite elegant, is having an unknown concept. So the idea is that you would be able to make predictions across your concept set, and you could attribute, a given weight or percentage to each individual concept. And then there might be this final unknown concept, which captures all of the information which can't be explained what you've defined by a priori.
Got it. Okay, and then the concepts themselves, they are labeled, right? So they need to be pre-labeled data that's that the model is predicting, right?
Yeah, so they're supervised. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Let me see what else. So I have several questions. So, okay, so let's switch topic just a little bit. But if in CBMs, right? If a clinician was to intervene and conclude that the current prediction was inaccurate, how would be the outcome of this? So would this information then be used to further train the model and then strengthen it, or would the training halt as a result? Would it basically introduce bias?
Do you want to start? Yeah, it's again a very good question. The intervention is something that you're working on, for instance. There's no clear way to do that because there are a lot of possibility. As you know, as Greg mentioned, you have the leakage. So if you have two concepts that share a lot of information together, so that correlate. If you modify the one, you can modify another one. So you have a lot of coupling process inside. So it's why the question of intervention is highly connected to the question of the concept design. So you need to have, as Greg mentioned, to have some orthogonal, so that means non-overlapping concept. And in that way, you can modify one concept without modifying the other concept. So for instance, if the clinicians saw that the result is not accurate due to two concepts, you want to modify these two concepts, but you don't want that the modification of these two concepts will modify the other ones, because maybe by correcting these two concepts, it will modify the other ones that will drive to another inaccurate prediction. So it's why it's very important to well design the concept, and maybe sometimes to add an unknown concept. And after that, you can use some intervention. But again, it's an ongoing research question. So you have some ideas to deal with that by minimizing the leakage, by creating a good set of concepts that prevent this risk. But if I put on the side this research question, the idea is at the end when the clinician use of the inaccurate prediction, you just have to modify one concept without modify the other one. And after you can back propagate this information into the neural network to redo some training step to have a better result and so have something more accurate.
Great, makes sense. Oh, that's an interesting question here. So, so far the focus has been on the explainability of how AI works for healthcare professionals. So what are your thoughts on the explainability of AI for patients and their need to know how healthcare professionals are using AI in their practice?
Again, it's a very good question for the moment, because I think it's a very recent research topic. So a lot of things are not totally mature. So in our case, you focus more on the clinician, on the expert side, and not really on the patient side. Or maybe on the patient side, the only way of thinking to include the patient is on some feedback. That sometimes the patient can give some feedback about the process, about the patient trajectory. But I'm not very close to this, because I'm a physicist and Greg, she's a computational scientist. So I don't know if Chris is here. Chris is our colleague that more from, Chris, maybe you can answer this question. So Chris is raising his hand, so if you can let him speak. Can I? Yep.
I'm trying, but I don't have the power.
Chris, you can unmute yourself normally.
Should be able to know.
I can jump in whilst Chris is trying to unmute himself. So I think there's a couple of things that I would add. So one is, so I think part of the question says, how can healthcare professionals be supported to translate the complexity of the AI systems they're using so it's easily understandable for the patient? So at least the aim with these CBM models is really to align the explainability with how the clinicians already reason, think, and do the diagnosis. So we use clinical concepts like stage and age because this is the type of thing that they're already reporting on, and those are the kind of the features or the clinical properties that a doctor would explain then to a patient. So the CBMs really is help to try and align that thinking, so it's not a complex information that the doctor then has to kind of try and translate back to the patient. The other thing I would add is that we work very closely with PPI, so patient and public involvement, and so having patients as part of the co-development of any AI tools or algorithms to make sure we're aligning or steering that development in a way which aligns with patient benefit and patient impact, I think is really important. And I think PPI is now is kind of one of the core recommendations or even fundamental things that you need to have for a given grant or research project.
Great. And then one more here. So we have someone saying that AI models are usually trained to improve performance, but it often results in outliers being left out or plainly ignored. So especially when data sets for rare diseases, right? They don't have a big enough data set to train a full AI model. So the question is, if the tool that you're working has safe ways of handling these anomalies of rare diseases.
You want to start, Greg, or should I? Okay, I can start. Yeah, it's a very good question again.
I managed to get in, so.
Yeah, for the rare disease, in our lab, you don't really focus on rare disease, but again, Chris, maybe if you can speak, I can tell you a little bit more. I know I have some colleagues in South of France that work on that, and yeah, so you have some different strategy. One strategy you can train your model on some a complex disease, non-rare, and after you can use some transfer learning by expecting the two diseases are close enough to transfer the information. There's also some people that design directly by some generation of new data to complement the lack of data. So there are different strategy. But Chris, maybe you have some improvement.
Yes, forgive me. I joined in a way where I could not speak. It was a shame, but I'm in now. Yes, so rare diseases, and I can also comment a little bit on the patient aspect. So rare diseases, I think, it's a very important question because we can leverage huge amounts of data for the common pathologies, and we can learn a lot about them, and then you end up with this kind of bias. So I've worked for many years on rare diseases, and something that I think concept bottleneck models really gives us an edge on in terms of understanding and interpreting rare diseases, particularly sort of unsolved genetic conditions, where you don't even have a clear route to diagnosis and things like that, is that you can kind of leverage the interpretability to group conditions and understand them a little bit better. So something that I'm working on at the moment is to essentially train a concept bottleneck model to take sort of raw genomic data, let's say, and predict via independent genomic concepts a particular known diagnosis. And this might be a common diagnosis. And then what you can do is you can take a patient with rare disorders, you can pass them through this concept bottleneck model, and it won't be able to diagnose them accurately, but what you might be able to do is generate an understanding of the explainable concepts that can kind of map to that condition. And then through that, you can kind of gain new insights into the pathology of these rare diseases, leveraging your understanding of how to take raw data into interpretable concepts into diagnosis. You might not be able to do the final step because you don't have enough data to leverage it, but you can utilize all the data that you've had in the past to leverage to understand these common conditions to kind of get a deeper understanding of the concept landscape. And I think that's one thing that's really important. The other thing, just to go back to the patient aspect, I think this is, a potentially really powerful concept bottleneck paradigm, and explainable AI is a really nice way of bringing the patient back into the loop. We have a lot of sort of closed door meetings as a clinician. So half my time I also work as a clinician as well as wrapping and stuff. And there's a lot of kind of clinical concepts that are discussed among doctors that have very specific clinical meanings. But then there's also things that are very important for patients to understand, about sort of treatment times, treatment options, things like that. And what you can do is you can start to think about patient views, and you can try and incorporate them into potential decision pathways through this explainable AI. So you can have multiple sources of information coming from clinical data, for instance, like your MRI or your histopathology slides, as we've been hearing about today. But you can also have other sources of input into these models, which can come from sort of patient views. You can imagine sort of chatbots, apps where patients are able to give views on their treatments. They can be brought in via concepts into the clinical decision-making process. And this gives a much more interactive way of bringing the clinician and the patient together, often when they're not, in the same room, which is the main way in which we communicate at the moment. So I think it's a very exciting way of bridging that gap between the patient and the clinician. Those are just my thoughts. Sorry for not being able to talk earlier.
Perfect. That makes sense. So we're hitting the hour now. So I wanted to thank you, Anthony, Greg, and Chris for sharing their thoughts and expertise. And this event was really wonderful and a very valuable contribution to the festival. So Anthony, if you could put the QR code again up, if that's possible.
Yeah.
So the audience, please take a moment to scan the QR code and answer one question to help us with our evaluation of the festival. So, of course, thank you to all the audience for coming to this talk. And just a reminder that this festival runs until Saturday, the 24th of May, and there are lots of other events in the program. So you can find out a bit more about the program by looking at the QR code, or if eventually attend an event in person, then you can speak to someone in a festival T-shirt if you'd like to know a bit more. All right. Thank you very much, everyone.